Today, I have 3 stories to tell. By the time I'm done, you'll understand how the government goes through so much fraud, but also how it has come to accept fraud as the default part of its own system.
Great if everything was nice, the schools were great, the streets were clean. But when you know that there's so much waste and there's so much fraud, and then all they're saying is we need to make people pay their share. To pay it to where? Where's it going? Who's benefiting from it? You know, when you see the $24 billion that was spent on the homeless in California, it's like you don't have any knowledge of where that money went. You can't audit it. This is bananas.
In 1967, Chicago's South Side Woodlawn was in a complete war zone. 2 factions going in an all-out turf war between the Black Disciples and the Blackstone Rangers. Jeff Fort was a member of the Blackstone Rangers, and he had a very specific skill: dispute resolution. That skill alone is how he absorbed 21 rival gangs and became the most powerful man in Woodlawn. One day, Jeff Fort reaches out to John Fry and convinces him to open his church to the Blackstone Rangers. In 2 years, they become friends, and Fry tells him to organize the gang as a community organization and how to navigate the bureaucratic world of grants and nonprofits. He then contacts the police superintendent and tries to broker a peace deal between the Black Disciples and the Blackstone Rangers, which got a lot of positive press. 2 years prior to this, in 1965, when Lyndon B. Johnson waged the war on poverty, the idea then was to fund impoverished communities under Jim Crow. But the local politicians were extremely against this. This is where the Opportunity Act was created. This was very important since you didn't send the money to the state capital, but directly to the private local nonprofit. The idea was the locals knew how to spend the money better than a bureaucrat. Its good intention is what paved the way for billions of dollars to be extracted without close to zero auditing. That sign of good faith by Fort and the Blackstone Rangers allowed the Woodlawn organization to partner with Reverend Fry. Together, they applied for the federal funds, pitching a plan to create neighborhood literacy and job training program for unemployed and out-of-school youth. When the Office of Economic Opportunity saw the positive press about the truce, it looked like a perfect grassroots nonprofit to invest into. They approved a huge grant of $900,000. Today, that would be roughly $9 million. But to make sure the Rangers would cooperate, the federal government agreed in writing to leave the gang's internal chain of command completely intact. Now Jeff Fort and his 21 main gang generals are on a direct federal payroll to be program project directors, administration, and classroom instructors. From day one, the mayor and the Chicago Police Department were furious. Not only was bypassing the city hall seen as a threat by the mayor, the police department saw the Rangers as violent criminals, not a nonprofit charity. The Chicago Police Department was not convinced. They logged every person who entered and exited, putting the training centers in constant surveillance. Even that wasn't enough. They wanted some insiders to flip. The person who flipped on them was George Mad Dog Rose. He was one of the top hierarchy who had fallen out with Jeff Fort, and he feared for his life. He explained in great detail how the funds were being diverted and stockpiled into an arsenal of sniper rifles and sawed-off carbines inside a church safe, and the entire job training was a way to fund and enforce gang discipline and fund criminal operations. Jeff Fort was then summoned to appear in front of a televised Senate hearing on July 9, 1968. The U.S. Senate voted 80-0 to cite him for contempt of Congress for walking out of the room after introducing himself. It wasn't until 1971 that a federal grand jury officially indicted Jeff Fort and 4 other high-ranking members of the Black Keystone Nation for conspiracy to defraud the United States government. Jeff Fort was sent to federal prison until 1976. The federal government spent the 1970s and 80s trying to clean up the mess, but they didn't fix the pipelines. They just added a layer to it by adding the state. The block grants moved the money through the state governments first, but states had no staff, no buildings, no infrastructure to run food drives or homeless shelters. They ended up handing the money to the exact same private nonprofits that LBJ built in 1964. The door was wide open for a charity organization called Abundant Blessings. It's a nonprofit that was based out of Hyde Park in South Los Angeles. The mission of this charity was to end homelessness, as stated by founder Alexander Sufer. Several years of smaller government contracts built enough of a track record that by 2023, he was contracted to provide stable and 3 nutritious meals a day for about 600 people without a home. For the first time, he was able to lock down $17 million. The grant came through a downtown nonprofit funded by Special Service for Groups, which was funded by LASA. Alexander Sufer was doing really well for himself, and his nonprofit was doing better than ever. He even bought a $7 million Westwood mansion. He paid for his children's elite private school tuition, bought a $125,000 Range Rover, and traveled by private jets. His personal ledger was filled with luxury resort stays from Florida to Hawaii. He even got a vacation property in Greece. LASA was receiving a bunch of complaints, and they'd been piling on from the hotlines about the actual living conditions inside his housing sites. Even the neighbors started to complain to the authorities about the lack of management and pure chaos in the properties. The auditors for LASA started noticing weird billing patterns coming from Abundant Blessings. But here's why it took so long for anyone to actually show up.
What are the plans to help with the homelessness?
See, the thing is, like, there's no statewide homelessness plan. Cities, counties, and continually are asking for more money. They're asking for $1 billion this year.
Like, how is the state getting away with it? Just like not doing the audit?
Audits, spending money, overspending money, no one accounting for money. But audits are important.
With enough complaints, investigators from LASA and the LA City Controller's Office did something they almost never do. They showed up there physically. And what they found was a filthy shelter, ovens filled with old food, microwaves completely soiled, storage closets filled in bulk of boxes of instant ramen noodles, canned beans, and breakfast bars. They sat Alexander Sufer down for a formal compliance routine. They demanded to see his financial books and asked him, did your charity's board of directors approve these spending choices? Sufer looked at them dead in the eyes and said, yes. That's when investigators pulled his nonprofit registration paperwork and started calling all the people in the board of directors. The entire board was fake. Some of the names were completely made up, and the people who were actually real had never heard of Alexander Sufer or Abundant Blessings in their lives. When the board was exposed as fake, the auditors immediately contacted the IRS, the FBI, and HUD Inspector General. The federal forensic accountants went through his books and found he had been fabricating every receipt, using the name of real catering companies such as Revolution Kitchen, security firms such as Armed Elite Services, sending Photoshop receipts to the government. In reality, it was all going directly to his personal account. His contract with the city had one strict rule. He could not be his own landlord. The government would pay rent to house the homeless people, but that rent had to go to a third party and not himself. He had essentially built an entire paper organization, fake vendors, fake board members, fake rosters, and fake leases. All of it designed to survive a desk review where someone checks if the math adds up. It all came crashing down when federal agents swarmed his Westwood mansion. Sufer was hit with a massive federal wire fraud indictment along 11 state felony counts of conflict of interest. He was arrested in January 2026 and has already made bond. His trial was supposed to begin in April 2026. The way we give money to nonprofits in the United States is currently the default. This entire process incentivizes fraud due to a blind honor system in hopes that the state, to the third party, and to the NGO will all be honest. These NGOs have fraud every year and are very hard to get rid of because if a politician tries to dismantle the system, they'll go straight to the media and say the politician hates the homeless, hates the sick, hates the disadvantaged. And that headline alone is enough to kill any investigation before it starts. So now it's safer to keep the system that enables this fraud than fix it. And keep in mind that these NGOs are heavily lobbying the government. One of the biggest cases of all time is called Feeding Our Future. Amy Bach ran a tiny nonprofit called Feeding Our Future. It's a federal child nutrition program funded by the USDA meant to give free meals to low-income kids. The kids were supposed to be physically sit in a designated place like a school or a daycare and eat a meal in front of an adult supervision. 2020 came along with COVID, and soon after the lockdowns, the government didn't want the children to starve. And because of social distancing, if you're a restaurant owner, pretty much most of your income just dried up from one day to the next. You can't see an end to the lockdowns, and you're laying off staff. And even the fastest states that fully reopened, it took at least 5 months, which is a death sentence to most restaurants. So Amy Bach had an idea. She would go to these struggling restaurants and ask them to let her be their sponsor. And her nonprofit would receive money from the government to pay the restaurants. She would act as if the middleman and her administration existed to oversee the restaurants to see if they were, in fact, feeding the kids and handle the paperwork. The government allows the sponsors to keep 10 to 15% of all the money as an administrative fee, and that's the catch. The restaurants joined and the money started flowing in. And in 2019, her nonprofit made $3.4 million. By 2021, it was raking in $200 million. The state auditors at Minnesota Department of Education in the fall of 2020, they looked at the numbers and it was mathematically impossible for her to feed that many children. They billed the government for 3.9 million meals. To get paid, they had to submit a roster listing the names and ages of the kids they were feeding. Instead of finding real kids, they went to a website called listofrandomnames.com and copied the generated text and pasted it into their official government spreadsheets. When the auditors looked at the names like Region Pumpker, British Melanie, Serious Problem, and even Jeffrey Dahmer, it was obvious they were not feeding anybody. At that point, the state froze Feeding Our Future and the money stopped going to Amy's nonprofit. When Amy found out that the state was freezing her nonprofit, she did something most people wouldn't do. She turned around and sued the state government. When they got in front of the judge, the state was having a hard time finding all the data regarding the restaurants and information regarding the case. Amy said that the MDE employees deliberately misspelled the words and mislabeled the documents to hide how badly they failed to oversee the program. Since a lot of the restaurants she was partnered up with were East African immigrants in the Minneapolis area, Amy claimed that the state was only freezing her funds of racial and religious discrimination. The judge looked at the case and told the state that they didn't have an ironclad proof of a crime yet, and the state faced a choice: keep fighting and risk losing discrimination lawsuit or resume payments, and they chose to pay. What the state didn't know is that Amy knew this would happen. She had been filing as a third party to the state for years. She knew exactly how disorganized and understaffed the record keeping was. So she misspelled the documents she was sending to make it even harder for the state to find and organize their files. After beating the state, Amy was untouchable. She was going to get more money from the restaurants by getting them to pay her under the table as a pay to play. Every month, employees from Feeding Our Future would pull out this phone, FaceTime Amy, and she would look at the screen and visually confirm the cash was in hand. Amy and the full operation had more money than they knew what to do with. The state decided to contact the FBI since they couldn't get the courts to see reason. and the FBI and the IRS officially opened up a criminal investigation. At this point, this was an entire operation, and it wasn't just Amy in on this. It was about 70 complicit across 250 fake sites. The FBI and IRS were observing for about 10 months. Federal forensic accountants were wiretapping their phones, tracking their bank accounts, and watching them buy all of these things with stolen cash. Early January 2022, the FBI coordinated a massive armed raid across Minnesota to shut down Feeding Our Future forever. This was the largest pandemic-era fraud prosecution in United States history. There were 79 suspects indicted with a mountain of paperwork evidence against them. The vast majority of people involved gave up almost immediately after being caught. During one of the co-defendants' trials in 2024, someone left $120,000 cash at a juror's home. 5 people were charged for attempted bribery. Out of the 79 people, 66 were convicted, each one turning on each other to get lighter sentences. Amy Bach and the top central co-conspirators maintained that they were innocent right until the end and took their chances with the jury. It massively backfired. The jury found her guilty of conspiracy, wire fraud, and bribery. She would spend over 14 months in Sherburne County Jail waiting for sentencing. She was sentenced to more than 41 years in federal prison and ordered to pay back $243 million in restitution. Out of the $250 million stolen, only about $75 million has been physically recovered. One of the main reasons the position of the government is to accept NGO fraud as the default is because in order to prosecute fraud, the money has to be spent. Even if the IRS and the FBI knows someone is committing the crime, when the auditors of the state or third party are either incompetent, understaffed, or disorganized, that invites more fraud, since that could be years of money being spent in either oversight or blatant criminal activity. With the NGOs also being able to lobby the government, it's hard to say if the politicians in Washington are receiving a kickback or at least sway to keep the system in place. With the NGOs making up about 10% of the private sector, there is no way for the state to catch every NGO committing fraud. When you give money without accountability, you have a system that incentivizes fraud.